Welcome back to the real minimum requirement. Today we're going to check out RoboCup Rogue City. The system requirement from them said that's an Intel Core i7 4790 or a Ryzen 5 2600, 16 gig of RAM, GeForce GTX 1650 4GB or AMD Radeon RX 480 4GB. Welcome to Respawn PC, I'm Dunk, let's dive in. First of all, I want you to keep in mind this is the demo of RoboCup Rogue City. The game actually coming out on November 2nd. And since the game isn't out, in the minimum requirement there's an additional note saying please note that these information aren't final and may be subject to change until the launch of the game. So my guess is they did some tests to check out for minimum requirement to just put some info on the Steam page. But let's give them a hand and try to find out what is the real minimum requirement for the game. Obviously, we're not going to start with what they said should be the minimum requirements. We're going to drop to my trusty i5 2500, keep the 16 gig of RAM for now, and a GTX 960, which is just under the power of the GTX 1650. When you first boot up the game, there's auto detect your settings. So I let it as default to see what is going to place me. And it was 720p medium, and at that I was at 39 FPS, reaching some peak at almost 50 and some dip in the about 20s. But that means there's also some juice we can squeeze in on the hardware. This is the auto detecting recommended graphic settings, and I'm happy to see that I guess the game will come out with DLSS 3.5, FSR 2.2 and Intel XeSS. We might be able to play with even lower GPU. Before switching some hardware, I decided to try 1080p, still everything at medium, and we reach a 31 FPS. It's highly playable since it's not a PvP multiplayer game, but let's get back to lower hardware since this is higher than expected. So the first drop we do is the memory. So we downgrade from 16 gig to 8 gig of memory. The game still put the setting at medium, and running at medium we get a 29 FPS. Sometime going in high 30, almost 40, and going down to the 25, 23. And if you lock the FPS at 30, it's butter smooth, but we can still go down in hardware. Next downgrade is the GTX 950. This is a 2GB card, which is 2GB lower than what they recommend for the minimum requirement. Now the settings are at low for 720p, but we're reaching a 26 FPS. My guess is when FSR 2.2 will be available, the GTX 950 will be able to reach the 30 FPS, hopefully. So this is a maybe win, or a win when the FSR will be enabled. Then the next GPU is the AMD RX 550. 2GB. 720p at low, we get a nice 8 FPS. Even if FSR was available, I don't think this card will be a choice. Then trying the GT 1030, 720p low, we get a little boost to 12 FPS. Another 2GB card, that is not worth it. And I have some doubt FSR will help in any way. Since the CPU had some room to play with, I dropped to an i3 2100, and to go between a 2GB and a 4GB card, I went to the GTX 1060 3GB. I was getting a 41 FPS, but since now the CPU is PEG, I guess the 1060 is a nice pair with the 2500, because this i3 give me a lot of stutter. And I decided to go back to the GTX 950 with the i3 2100 to see how it fared. With the i5 2500 I was getting a 26 FPS, and with the i3 2100 I get a 25 FPS. Really similar result, but I want to check something else. If you boost to the 16GB instead of 8GB, because so far in every test the 8GB is fully maxed out on every test. So now with a little bit more of memory, we're reaching a 29 FPS. This is quite playable and it's quite a smoother also. And when FSR 2.2 is available, I'm guessing we're going to be even over the 30 FPS. I guess we have a winner for now, but I still want to test some first gen Intel CPU. The first gen in question is the i5 650. Try with the 8GB of RAM and the GTX 950. With that setup at 720p low, we get an average of 20 FPS. I wonder if adding more memory, it will help on the FPS, like 16GB. So with the same setup, but adding 8GB for a total of 16GB doesn't change much. We now 24 FPS average. Maybe it will be better when FSR 2.2 will be available. Then I upgrade to the GTX 960. which is a 4GB compared to the GTX 950. The 4GB should reach at least the minimum VRAM recommended for the game. I also kept the 16GB of memory, and we get an average of 34 FPS, and still without FSR 2.2. It's highly playable, reaching a peak of 47 FPS and a low of 22. Then I threw in the GTX 1060 3GB. Less memory, a little bit more powerful. I was getting a little bit more FPS, but the VRAM is really the issue here. And also for some reason, I get higher dip in FPS, sometimes reaching 14 FPS. But the I are also higher, at 47, making it a bit unstable. But if you lock the FPS at 30, you have a smooth experience. And maybe FSR 2.2 will solve that issue. So those are the winner for the real minimum requirement for Robocop Rogue City demo. The i5-2500 8GB GTX 950, the i3-2100 8GB GTX 950, and the i5-650 16GB and GTX 960. You should expect better performance when the game is out and when DLSS, FSR and XeSS is available. That's it for the real minimum requirement for Robocop Rogue City. I really like the demo for the time I played. I'll let the trailer finish running, and in the meantime, don't be shy to subscribe.
I think we can both agree that you are no ordinary police officer.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Those trigger-happy maniacs have a ton of hostages.
Drop it, scum.
Anyone expecting a silver freak? Contact!
Lewis, you're here.
We need to get these elevators back online.
It's Robocop!
It's that service box, isn't it?
I am detecting a short circuit.
Wakey, wakey!
I'm looking at the map of this place, and it's huge.
OCP tracking device torn out. I am going to follow the blood trail.
However, one aspect of your composition that has been severely neglected is your human side, your brain.
We must smash that thing!
I've heard people refer to you by different names.
Okay there, Murphy?
Fire at will!
I'm curious to hear which one you prefer.
My name is